My name is C.Maestas, and this is my final project presentation for History 250 Contemporary World. The country I chose for this project is Mexico. The reason I chose Mexico is twofold. The first reason is that my adoptive family history and relatives come from Mexico and what used to be the Mexican territories in southwestern United States. I wanted to know more about Mexican history than I remember from high school, which is pretty well limited to remembering the Alamo. The second reason I chose Mexico is that because I've always been curious about why Mexico still struggles as a developing nation even into the 21st century. Mexico, Canada, and the United States all were discovered, colonized, and settled by European powers during the same era. They all had revolutions or some sort of break away from their European powers. They all have or had significant natural resources, raw materials, and ports along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. Yet Mexico still lags behind the other two nations on the North American continent. Various ancient civilizations rose and fell in Mesoamerica in the 2,500 years prior to the early 16th century when the Spanish explorers first arrived. Many people are at least passingly familiar with the Aztec or the Maya. Fewer still have heard of the Olmec or the Toltecs that preceded them. The first European explorers arrived in Mexico from Cuba in 1517. The real conquest of Mexico began in 1519 when Hernan Cortes arrived with an army of about 400 men. He attacked and killed thousands of nobles, including the Emperor Montezuma, while trying to capture the capital of Tenochtitlan in the fall of 1519. His army was driven from the city but returned 2 years later, and with the help of some of the Aztecs' native rivals, Cortes ultimately laid siege to Tenochtitlan, defeated the last resistance in August of 1521. Just short of 250,000 people are thought to have been killed in the conquest of Tenochtitlan, and it was the end, functionally, of the Aztec Empire. Cortes razed the city of Tenochtitlan and founded Mexico City, which quickly became the premier European center in the New World. Just for reference, this happened about 95 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth. During the colonial period, New Spain, as Mexico was known, was governed by a representative from the Spanish Iberian Peninsula, who was appointed by the King of Spain. The first exported materials were gold and other precious metals that were extracted and carried to Spain to enrich the kingdom. Ships of treasure filled with gold and silver made an attractive target for pirates. As much as I wanted to get into those stories, I have a time limit and we have to stay focused. In addition to other natural resources, cash crops such as cotton and sugar cane were produced using indigenous labor who were paid very low wages. African slaves were also a source of labor in New Spain. During the 17th century, about 110,000 people who had been born in Africa were counted as living in New Spain. A 10-year-long War of Independence began in 1811 and ended in 1821 when Mexico achieved its independence from Spain. Mexico struggled to realize a functioning government, and the War for Independence left Mexico impoverished and with a lack of organized infrastructure. In the 1840s, the Mexican-American War and the independence and ultimate loss of Texas, followed by the Mexican secession of 1848, took a toll on Mexico's government and resources, as well as leaving the country about 50% smaller than it was at the beginning of that century. The Mexican cession included land that would later become California, Nevada, and Utah, as well as portions of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. There are scholarly debates on whether the Mexican War was an example of American imperialism, and I can certainly see the point on both sides. Mexico's troubles were far from over, though. A civil war broke out in 1857, and because Mexico had defaulted on its international debts, the French landed an army in 1862. The French forces marched to the capital of Mexico City and took control. To the north, the Americans were involved in their own bloody civil war and were in no position to care about what was happening in Mexico. The French government installed Maximilian of Austria as Emperor of Mexico, but that only lasted about 3 years. the Mexican people continued to fight through that time and overthrew the French regime, ultimately executing Maximilian. For the next 30 or so years of Mexico's history were ruled by Porfirio Diaz, one of the military generals who fought in both the Civil War and against the emperor. While it was generally a peaceful time, Diaz was a military dictator and acted as military dictators do. He silenced dissent, he rigged elections, ensured that the rich and privileged continued to get richer and more privileged. There was a military coup in 1911 that overthrew Diaz's successor, and then again in 1913 when the Mexican Revolution. It was not so much of a revolution as it was another civil war. The revolution was fought throughout Mexico and caused serious damage to institutions and infrastructure throughout the country. In 1917, a new government and a new constitution were established. Following the Russian Revolution, Mexico was the first Latin American country to establish diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union in 1924. Revolutions in other countries carried a theme of equality for the working people and themes of the peasants against the bourgeoisie or the landed gentry, but Mexico never really took those themes to the extreme that the USSR did, and later as they did in Cuba. We'll come back to that in a minute. During the Cold War, Mexico had an interesting position. The Wilson Center, chartered by Congress in 1968 as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research. While researching Mexico's role in the Cold War, I was somewhat surprised when I found that according to the Wilson Center, the status of the relations between Mexico and the Soviet Union after 1945 represents a black hole which has not yet received proper attention by specialized literature. I did find some interesting information from a declassified and translated document from the USSR in 1963. What I did find was that Mexico played a kind of balancing act between both sides during the Cold War. It had to be careful because its largest trading partner and source of investment capital was the United States, and it could not afford to upset its northern neighbor too much. Mexico voted against expelling Cuba from the Organization of American States when the U.S. called for this expulsion. Mexico also refused to vote on sanctions for Cuba from the OAS. Mexico maintained its close ties with Cuba as part of a Latin American former Spanish colony perspective, but also from an ideology of the respective revolutions. Earlier interpretations by historians often depicted Mexico as a peaceful haven and a weak neighbor forced to submit to U.S. pressure. However, an author by the name of Renata says that Mexico did in fact suffer from the political and social turbulence that characterized by the Cold War era in general. By maintaining relations with Cuba, it played a unique and overlooked role in the hemispheric Cold War. The Cuban Revolution was an especially destabilizing force in Mexico because Fidel Castro's dedication to many of the same nationalist and populist causes that the Mexican revolutionaries had originally pursued in the early 20th century called attention to the fact that the government had abandoned those promises effectively for the Mexican people. For over 50 years, the only way for an American citizen to travel into Cuba was to go through Mexico. I think that is an excellent example of how Mexico played both sides of the conflict during the Cold War. Globalization in Mexico has indisputably positive effects on the national economy. In the 1980s and 90s, Mexico loosened its trade restrictions, greatly reduced tariffs, and signed the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, with the United States and Canada. These actions contributed to the tripling of Mexico's GDP between 1980 and 1992. In the year 2000, then President Ernesto Zedillo gave a speech to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce where he stated, "Globalization has helped Mexico steer towards a democratic transformation without having to undergo an accompanying economic crisis." Another effect of NAFTA has been the modernization of Mexico's workforce and manufacturing capabilities. The proximity to the U.S. is a notable advantage, but the rising cost of doing business in China has also made Mexico more attractive for U.S. and Canadian companies. The fact that an executive or designer can be in a San Diego tech company office for a breakfast meeting and be reviewing circuit board and assembly plans in a Baja California plant for lunch is a great example. Knowledgeable industry watchers predict the Cali-Baja region will become North America's next Silicon Valley. I was surprised to discover a list of some of the things that are made in Mexico that are really big sellers in the United States. Procter & Gamble makes Crest and Colgate in Mexico, as well as Gillette razors and blades. Both Gulfstream and Lear produce jets and jet components in Mexico. The Cadillac Escalade, the Chevy Silverado, Dodge Ram trucks, and the Ford Fusion are all made south of the border. And if you look at automotive parts, Mexico sells the United States twice as much as Japan does. Mexico is the third largest manufacturer of tires in the world. Vizio flat-screen TVs are made in Mexico, as are Bose speakers, the Fender Stratocaster, and many other goods. Cemex is a Mexican company. It is the second largest producer of concrete in North America. And in a strange example I found in my own house, some sort of backwards cultural appropriation, Old El Paso stand and stuffed taco dinner kit, which is about as far as authentic Mexican cuisine as you can get, is ironically a product of Mexico. Shannon O'Neill, Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, says that while Mexico faces many challenges, including a volatile global economy and implementation of oil, telecommunication, and finance reforms, the biggest of all is the rule of law. Mexico's biggest challenge continues to be the deep-seated corruption that runs rampant through the country. It contaminates politicians, schools, businesses, police, immigration into the United States. 72% of Mexicans consider corruption to be a very big problem. The Wilson Center said, Mexico's problem is not criminality or violence, but the absence of effective government institutions capable of maintaining order, imposing rules, and earning the respect of the citizenry. Fighting corruption is a daunting business. It means dismantling Mexico's entrenched systems of cronyism, influence peddling, and privileges, and guaranteeing that no one, no matter how powerful he or she may be, is above the law. Through researching this presentation, I found the answer to my question about why Mexico has lagged her two northern sisters in development. Mexico has had more armed conflicts with both external forces and internal strife, and they have devastated this country over the past 2 centuries. After being colonized by Spain for 300 years, a 10-year war for independence, and a few years later, the Mexican-American War, resulting in a loss of land and ultimately resources, an American invasion, a French invasion, a European emperor, a military dictatorship, another revolution and civil war, the Cold War, and the war on drugs. Mexico's relationship with the United States is often noisy and bellicose. But at the end of the day, like any sibling in any family, any real threat to the security of Mexico would be dealt swiftly and decisively by the United States and Canada. Mexico is coming into a new world of trade and economic power that could propel her and her people into a major player on the world stage. Time will tell if Mexico is up to the task. These are my references and sources. This is only a draft presentation, and these will be cited appropriately in the final copy. In my opinion, the very best thing to come out of Mexico is the Chihuahua, the national dog. This one is mine.